Welcome, welcome, welcome to our continuing series, possibly the most important discussion in America, at least in my opinion. Political division in America, where is it? Where is it going? You could be for it, you could be against it, you could be on the left, you could be on the right, you could be tall, you could be short, we don't matter. It doesn't matter. What we wanted to do was have an intelligent conversation about an important topic that deserves serious consideration. With us today, it is our pleasure, Department of Politics at Cal Poly Humboldt, Professor Alison Holmes. She's also done presentations for the Center for California Studies as a visiting scholar. She works at the Department of Politics in Cal Poly Humboldt. Born and raised in Oklahoma, headed to Northwestern University at 16, spent a summer volunteering in Northern Ireland during a very dangerous time, it seems like. Quickly changed my major to social policy. Graduating in 1985, I went straight to the University of Chicago, where I learned more about policy. That's a great policy school. Helped found a campus community volunteer program and spent every spare moment in the UK. 1987, I moved to London and got a job with the Liberal Democrats, a third party in British politics, doing research and writing briefs and speeches on Northern Ireland. I quickly moved into campaign and became the general election coordinator for the party's 1992 campaign. I stayed until the 97 election, became the national campaign manager, 10 years and a doubling of Lib Dem representation in Parliament later. I left to join the BBC as the deputy head of corporate communication strategy and helped launch the BBC News 24 and BBC Online. 3 years later, I was headhunted by a public relations firm to advise clients on corporate social responsibility. Managing director of the London office of the largest UK-US business membership organization. Between elections is my favorite part. I enrolled at the London School of Economics, first for a diploma in world politics and then a PhD part-time. I was awarded a doctorate in international relations in 2005. Many other accolades there. Here's the school, London School of Economics, a little bit jealous. And then, of course, she wrote this article where she took her background in international studies, international relations, and applied it to how California could operate in the current political climate. Professor, did I get anything wrong? Was there anything you'd like to add?
It's all true. It's all true.
Okay. I am sure you have heard about Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can go ahead and make the, like everybody does when I mention the name in California. Marjorie Taylor Greene came out on President's Day and said, political divisions are so bad between the red and the blue, we need to have a national divorce. Now, she wasn't artful with her message, and she wasn't exactly clear if she was talking about splitting states up or full-blown secession, and that's on her. But it does seem to have caused a viral conversation. When you were doing your study on California a few years ago, people were still talking about Trump's president. Trump can hurt California. Maybe his values and those people that back him are out of line with our values. There was some discussion of Calexit. I'd like you to take a moment in time from then and then fast forward to now. Has political division gotten better, gotten worse, or stayed the same, in your opinion, as an American and also as a professional scholar?
Good question. Thank you for having me. It's always fun to kind of ponder these big questions, step back a little bit, and try and think about what we think. And I think that it's always a useful pause to try and see how far we've come and what we've been thinking in the meantime. But I'm not sure that it's a need to fast forward, because I think it's all part of a longer trajectory. And I think that there's been a lot of interesting conversation even since we first started talking about, and I'll go back even further than just the Trump presidency. I think that and of course I will say this, wouldn't I, because I do international relations, which is looking at much larger patterns and higher patterns sometimes. And I would say that when we first started talking about globalization in earnest, there was one of the big debates at the time was whether or not globalization means homogenization or Americanization, or if it means fragmentation. If we are getting bigger units that will be either regional or even global, or will we fragment into almost back to city states? So the idea of trying to, the way that the nation state has evolved is first from nations and then these combined nation states. And there is no country in the world that does not have within it lots of other units or older units that came together because it was in those times and places and spaces, those political entities felt the need for their own either military or economic prosperity, that the bigger unit was a safer place to be. And that's certainly the history of the United States, in the face of empires who were trying to vie for the economic resources and possibilities that what they considered to be virgin territory what might bring them. And so that whole storyline of becoming the United States, for international relations scholars, always makes it kind of humorous because, of course, in IR, a state is an entire country, whereas every American thinks, oh, well, that's just like Oklahoma or California or Texas. It's like, well, no, actually, that's the word we usually use for an entire country. And our country does often behave as if each state is a separate country, certainly in terms of personality or culture. And I think that what we've really seen is not just in the United States, but all over the world, the idea that the nation state as a can into which we have dumped all of these other entities and identities are cracking, are beginning to fracture. And so I guess I see it as not so much a Trump thing or an American thing, but I'm interested in how big ideas evolve and change and travel around the world, and they take different amounts of time in different places, but they often, like the Age of Revolution, right? The French Revolution wasn't just happening in France. It wasn't just going on in France. It was happening something like it in the United Kingdom, something like it was happening obviously here in the United States. So this idea of what the individual's role is in a political entity was fundamentally shifting down to the idea that we didn't want a monarchy. We wanted people to have the ability to vote for its own governance structures, and that literally traveled around the world. And I guess what I'm interested in as a scholar myself is, having watched globalization fights about the creation of the European Union and the creation of ASEAN, or the Organization of American States, all of those regional blocks. Everybody thought that they were going to follow the EU, right? Lots of places around the world were looking at the European Union as a way of looking at pooled sovereignty and wanting to become more powerful economic blocks. And now they're cracking up. So I guess I feel like it's not it might be a particular flavor. The American flavor is its own thing, but I don't think that it's an American phenomenon. And I think that it's an interesting question, how nation states, can they break up peacefully? Can we have a healthy, friendly divorce, or whatever happens in the world? So the UK has left the European Union, didn't work out so well. It's still a long struggle. It's going to be very complicated and very messy, and we're not good at breaking up nicely. So therefore, I guess the hope is that perhaps we can ride out the bumpy patch in the hope that we can actually create another way of operating as an entity that would not require a divorce, right? It's if we're going to use the analogy of a couple, then we would like to think that we won't come to divorce. We'll have some therapy, we'll talk it out. But also, I think that the networks in the United States are so integrated, it becomes a particular problem. I don't understand. Well, I don't understand a lot of things about Marjorie Taylor Greene, but the one thing I don't understand in this context is how do you define red and blue? Is it the county? Is it the town? Is it the governor? Is it the senators? I think our personalities are kind of schizophrenic in one way or another, and I think that's one of the things that's this. What I've been researching most recently is from that work in California is what I would call subnational diplomacy, and we talk about Los Angeles. The State Department has just created an entire department to look specifically at the subnational level of how cities and counties and states operate on the global scene. And the State Department wants a piece of that action, because clearly a lot of these entities are acting up. They're acting out on the global stage in a way that has become accessible to them as a result of globalization. And so how do they coordinate that work? How do they all bring their own innovative styles to that space? And we haven't worked out how to coordinate that yet. So right now it's all very messy. And I don't know exactly how we're going to deal with the messiness, because I do think that's a challenge. But I'm hopeful that we can actually get through the messy and actually find a way that it's more, in political terms, we would call subsidiarity, right? If you let the lowest level of responsibility take responsibility. You try not to over centralize and you try not to fragment, but you find the right level for what the issue is. And anybody from Los Angeles, for example, or Mumbai or London will tell you is that cities have a huge responsibility for a lot of direct services. And therefore,
Right.
that puts them right on the front line for a lot of those issues that are really like climate change, you think is a global issue, but what it's doing to the Port of Los Angeles and the citizens of LA is incredible in terms of, rising tides or pollution from the huge cargo ships, et cetera. They're right on that front line. And so how do they deliver those services as a city, even though that's within a state, within a country, et cetera?
Let me ask a few questions if I
Yeah,
may.
no, please do.
So I think what you're saying is that yes, we're recognizing polarization here in America, but there is a larger trend of polarization and a pushback on democracy and well-functioning democracies across the world. I mean, we've seen this in Hungary and many other countries. And when Trump was coming about and people going, "Oh, look, it's an America phenomenon," they're going, "Look at Brexit. Look at Hungary. Look at Poland. Look at the Philippines. Look at Turkey." There seems to be this kind of backsliding, and that's fair. And there is a book out that talks about how there's a lack of democracy across many Western countries in the last couple of years, and America's right up there. But just to get to the bottom of it, you were in Northern Ireland. You have traveled around the world. You've done some ambassador like work. How bad are things in America in comparison to societies that are in a lot more turmoil, like Northern Ireland, other places that we would say, wow, that's a bad spot. Obviously, things have not improved from 2019 to now. As I've talked to many professors, they're going, hey, I was noticing political division 2019, 2020. And then we had January 6th. So wherever you were at before January 6th, I know for a fact you did not expect January 6th to happen, and you were probably shocked like the rest of us. So if things were already bad and people were already talking about Calexit and California government officials were already saying, we're an independent nation state, we can ignore the federal government, which is aware of what this California acting like an independent nation came from. That's 2019. That's before January 6th. How bad is it now compared to a few years ago? And how bad is it now compared to other troubled places in the world you've seen?
Well, I guess there's again a lot of layers in the question, right? Because I
Sure.
actually think even within California, there are a lot of layers that are complicated.
Sure.
So one of the things that we've also not reconciled well is the idea of tribal sovereignty with state sovereignty or U.S. sovereignty, and that whole concept of how responsible what that means in practical action. But also, I think one of the other big issues for a lot of places is the urban-rural divide. And in California, I'm up here in the far north of the state, and
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure Sacramento hasn't even got the first idea what Lassen and Modoc counties look like because it's just not part of their radar. We also have literally the state of Jefferson up here in Northern California, which is
Yeah.
actually rural Oregon and California, saying that in fact, urban Oregon and California don't understand the issues here. They don't understand we don't have effective healthcare. We don't have effective mental health care. We don't have policing. We don't have all kinds of services from the state that we should. And I think we really saw that being highlighted through the fires that were raging in the very far north of California. Lots of people don't quite understand a lot of those services that are being done in those rural parts of the state are actually being done by volunteers. That's not necessarily state support for all kinds of services that most people think that they would be able to expect. And I think that there's the rural urban divide has may shift again in California as a lot of people used COVID as a way to go out to the beautiful places of the state and work remotely. So it's going to be a very interesting question when a lot of the folks who used to live in urban areas have moved away from the urban areas. Now that's put a lot of pressure on the rural areas about housing prices, jobs for locals, all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it does mean that they may well begin to see and demand what these rural areas have not been able to get in the past from their state systems. So I think that it's kind of, I'm not sure where it stops, right? Once I start cracking open that the along those cleavages, where do they end. And so I'd rather not go down the road of every little crack and widening it. I'd rather go back and say, yes, there are cracks, but we need to try and work out what the problems are. Is it worse than other places or better than other places? Um, it's harder to say because, in fact, those cleavages don't go along ethnic and identity lines, right? I think you mentioned Northern Ireland a couple of times. Yes, I spent time there. I've worked a lot in the politics of Northern Ireland, but they have a convenient cleavage for the conflict of being Catholic and Protestant. And I don't think that you can find a way that the red and blue are nearly as doubling down on identities that you might find in other places. So the former Yugoslavia, or even in places like Ukraine, I think that it's, or Spain. I think you find an older historical wound, and you can grind it and put salt in it and widen it. But if it's such a mishmash, and I think that that's, the melting pot of the United States, for better or worse, is may make that a lot harder to find the cleavage. And
Sure.
I think that that's why the red and blue, as I said, the states, the counties, the towns, the state. I'm not sure how you decide who's red and who's blue. If I really start to try
Yeah.
and dig hard into that, I think I'm going to find a problem defining who's red and who's blue, because we're kind of a delightful mishmash. I hope it's a delightful mishmash. I find it a delightful mishmash, but nobody's tried to divide me one way or the other, I think.
Well, let's take a look at some of those questions in depth, and then we'll get to the rabbi's questions here. But let me show you this real quick. So this is a map that I've shown some people, and yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene was not very specific on how she'd do it. But if you look at Georgia, Texas, and Illinois, 90% of Georgia's red. It's purple only because of the Atlanta metro region. If you look at Texas, about 90% of Texas is red. Yeah, there's a few blue cities, but they're overwhelmed. It's purple because of the urban triangle from Houston to Dallas down to San Antonio, which represents no more than 1/5 of the landmass. If you look at Illinois, they say, oh, it's purple. No, it's not. Chicago is blue, and then 90% of Illinois is red. Now, when you look at water, power, transportation, and political districts, each state is already divided by water, power, and political districts between the red and the blue already. So Georgia already has a separate water and power district for Atlanta, separate from the rest. Texas already has separate water power districts for that urban area. Chicago has the same thing. So one idea would be, and I'm not saying this is what we have to do, but they're not really purple. If you split the blue Atlanta from the rest of Georgia, that blue Atlanta is going to stay 90% blue going 30 years out. The red part of Georgia is going to stay red going 30 years out because they don't have the drivers. There isn't really a metro pull in the urban area to create another metro area. So they'll stay largely rural. Same thing with Georgia. Would that be totally impossible given that we have had 3 states split off from other states? So it's totally legal. Kentucky from Virginia, Maine from Massachusetts, West Virginia from Virginia, Vermont from New York. I'm not saying this is the option, but is this at least a starting point for conversation?
I guess how many people who live in Atlanta or who work in Atlanta live somewhere outside Atlanta? And I think that the interesting question of dividing it that way helps who? I don't understand why would I deny my neighbors power or water? What am I trying to assert my sovereignty over? I guess I'm trying to work out what the in terms of the benefit of me somehow, and I'm intrigued by this idea that somehow the federal government spending would go down, when I think I would probably increase bureaucracy hideously to try and work out how we would negotiate through some of these things about power and water and freeways and who has permission to dig up what and all the other kinds of things that just, I'm next door to you, and I'm not quite sure what it benefits me to say we're now going to have 3 more layers of of government bureaucracy between me and my next door neighbor.
So there wouldn't be additional bureaucracy, and you would not be cutting off water power. So Atlanta has its own water power district, and then the rest of Georgia does. So nobody loses anything. I'm just saying that we already have.
No, I just that's a cleaner state than some. So I'm just trying to.
Yeah,
It draws out the problem of what does it benefit me to be able to say I'm somehow separate from my neighbor, and I don't quite know, especially when we are cheek by jowl, how we think that it's of use to us to be able to declare some kind of sovereign power over the resources that I've got, because otherwise what is the sovereignty for? And I think that's why my point about tribes is I think an important one, just because there's an understanding of what inherent sovereignty is, but it does not necessarily align with what international relations or politics people think about sovereignty. And that's precisely the reason of who have to who has to what am I trying to assert? What powers do I
sure,
have that I could actually use in the world? I can assert a lot of things about myself, but
sure.
if no one else recognizes them or understands them, then I'm not quite sure what benefit it does to me or anyone else to say I'm Superman. It's like,
I can answer that. I can answer. So the point is not to control anybody. I'm just pointing out that every state already subdivides all of its infrastructure into different regions, and that typically those overlap with this rural-urban divide. Just as a pattern. I worked in government for 20 years, studied infrastructure. That's all I'm pointing out.
oh yeah,
The point would be that Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, and this is why I asked, is political division real? She's saying political division between red and blue is so bad we just can't live with each other in states. So it'd be better to have and more peaceful if we said, okay, you blue guys go over here and rest guys separate states, and then we have more power devolved to the states so that we wouldn't be at each other's throats. That would I'm not saying you have to agree, but that was her goal. That was the goal of this idea.
and I understand that as the sort of the goal, but the problem is I just don't know in a practical sense. And if you, having spent time in government, the idea of those districts also don't necessarily align with counties. So some cities align exactly with a county, some don't. So the idea, and actually I was interviewing some folks from the county association in Washington, D.C., and basically they said they were so excited I went to go and talk to them because they said most people don't understand that you might pick up the phone and report a crime, but what happens to that person is all down to the county, the where they're going to take that person, the hospital, the emergency room, the jail. All of these things are county, not necessarily the city. So there's a whole interwoven network, and I'm not quite sure I want to be the person who tries to untangle that ball of yarn to work out who exactly then is running what in so many places. There might be places where it's much cleaner and easier, and other places where I'm not quite convinced it would be.
Oh, certainly. Certainly. There's places like Ohio where it's definitely a mixed pattern. It's checkerboard blue and red, and you couldn't do that. I'm just saying that in certain states, they already have their infrastructure split up into different regions for being able to manage it. We could already use those lines, and those divisions do match the counties. Now, that doesn't exactly work for every place. I'm just saying there's maybe a starting point for a conversation here. Not that this is the answer, but maybe there's something to look at.
But I think that peace is an idea that starts in the minds of people, and I think that division also starts in the minds of people. And I think the more we talk about division, the more division we will have, and the more we say, well, how do we work together, the more working together we will have. So I'm not about trying to make it about division. I'm trying to make it about how do you make sure you hear the voices of people who don't feel heard. How do you make a responsible, transparent democracy that people feel actually represents them in some meaningful way? And I'd rather talk about how we treat each other with respect and understanding, rather than trying to keep talking about why we should get divorced and why I don't like you. The more I think of reasons I don't like you, I bet I can come up with a whole bunch. I'm
Fair.
give me half a mo and I can come up with another five. But it's not the
Fair.
right way to approach. I'd rather be talking about, like, let's think of 10 ways we could actually make those counties and those districts and those towns and those places work better together and represent. I'll come back to Northern California. What can we do about rural education? What can we do about rural mental health? What can we do about I spent a year during COVID working for AmeriCorps, the California Office of California Volunteers for AmeriCorps, in food banks. And I can tell you now that there's a lot of broken systems underneath that COVID revealed in terms of how we help the poorest people in the state get food into food banks. And I, I was having a hard time convincing people of what those broken lines were and why people out there feel unheard and unhelped and alone.
Uh, Good points. So what can we do to bring everybody together? I'll go ahead and say that polarization is very bad. There's a chart up on the screen showing how uh, the people who identify themselves as hardcore Republicans and hardcore liberals has more than doubled from 1974 to 2016. So that's a hard fact. We have 2 times as many people who want nothing to do with the other side and won't talk to them. And for the Democrats, it's 59%. For Republicans, it's 78%. So that's majorities of both who are now hardened and don't want anything to do with the other side. How do we, and given that this trend goes back to 74 and certainly got exacerbated in the 90s, I've seen a lot of people go, oh, it's social media, it's Russia. Okay, well, then how did this start in the 90s? Social media wasn't a big factor till 2005, 2010. This goes back way before that. How do we stop this trend that's decades old and get everybody to come back together when it's not necessarily a lack of social media that's doing it?
I wish I knew. My students ask me this all the time. How do you try and make change in the world? How do you try to affect positive change in a world in which it's so hard to feel as if you're on the same page with other people? I agree. I don't, it does feel overwhelming. And I know a lot of my students feel overwhelmed about going out into the world in which they don't feel they could make a difference, right? So I guess what I tell them, and I'll share with you, is basically you do you. You do what you can in the spaces and the places where you operate. You look at the kinds of things that you are putting out into the world, and you are conscious and intentional about what you're trying to do, and strategic about where you put your efforts and how you present yourself to the spaces. I think part of polarization is demonization. One of the things I will say I learned in Northern Ireland is what you do to the enemy the minute they are less than human, the minute they are, and that's where I would say a lot of ugly language about Marjorie is deeply unfortunate, because I think the minute you can say that they are something less than, they are something I don't have to pay attention to, I don't have to understand them, we are then all complicit in the division. We are all part of the problem. My mother always used to say, Alison, are you part of the problem or are you being part of the solution right now? Right now, with what you're doing, is this part of the answer or is this part of the problem? And I think if a whole bunch of people ask themselves that more often, then I think we might find a way through the whole problem.
This is why I like talking with you, so that everybody that knows, Professor Alison Holmes is an expert in international relations and the thing. But on top of that, you'll also get life wisdom. I remember when I talked with you and saw your thing, it was like half academic and then half just wisdom, which we don't really do that much. It's not as popular these days. It's I got you in an argument. Let me ask you though, because I liked your statement. You're the first person that I've talked to who said, hey, Marjorie Taylor Greene could be crazy. Maybe she's bringing up bad ideas. Maybe she's not the right spokesperson. Maybe we shouldn't talk about it. But when you demonize the hell out of her, you make the problem worse. And obviously, Trump polarized America. I'm not a Trump fan. He made my mom cry for an hour. So we're never going to get along. But Joseph Biden goes on TV with a blood red backdrop and 2 active duty Marines, which presidents typically don't do, and then talks about how 78 million Americans are basically enemies of the state. And he does such a good job that he terrorizes all independent voters and some Democrats, saying, wow, Joe, I thought Trump was bad. How does this help bring us together? So is this an example of healing the divide or making it even worse? Yes, Trump was bad, but can we look at this and say not helpful either?
Well, I obviously, and I think that part of politics is symbolism. Part of politics is not looking weak. Part of politics is you have to be in a position to look like you're fighting back. And I'm sure that a lot of people advised him. wrongly or rightly, that basically he was looking weak and on the defense. And that's, I think, how we try and justify things that may or may not have been a very clever move. But I wouldn't disagree, and that's part of why politics I find toxic and difficult to deal with, because, as I say, not enough people asking themselves, is this really going to solve this? But you have a problem of when the person you're trying to deal with just won't give up, right? You don't know where to look if the person just refuses to take anything that you've said in any kind of good faith. And I think that that's always the biggest challenge in that kind of situation.
Thank you. I understand you have to go. One last question. We're going to go to the Rabbi Stephen Axelman. As a fellow American, all fellow Americans, he's in New York, you're in Northern California, I'm in Central California. Rabbi, what question do you have for the professor about political division, how bad it is, how we can heal it, or something related?
First of all, I'm honored to talk to you. I haven't listened to someone so intelligent in a while, and I have to get my brain moving. I have so many questions, so many comments. I guess I'll attack it from my hat as an LCSW, as a clinician, as a mediator. And I listened to lots and lots of webinars and seminars about how do you know that this marriage is over? And a lot of people in this country who feel we're not getting along use the abused spouse metaphor. And that was the first paper I ever wrote in social work school, was the 14 reasons why abused spouses don't leave. And they all get tied up in this. We're too intertwined. You won't be able to pay the bills without me. And no one's going to hire you. And you're going to die of starvation. And those are very much the answers of, we can't split up because you can't make it without us. So I guess my clinical hat says, how do you know when it's over? And are all marriages salvageable?
The problem with any kind of an analogy is there will always be the case that makes what you say absolutely painful and not possible. And so I want to veer a little bit away from the abused spouse, because I'm not sure that states are personifying an entity like a very complex state is not the same as this person and this person can or cannot get along. And I think there are absolutely situations in which, as you say, abused spouses feel, or the abuser feels, that they are able to try and make sure that I will keep you locked with me for the whatever danger this is that it presents to you. And I think that is a very horrible situation to be in. But I don't like to personify something as complicated as even a county, let alone an entire country, as being that individualized level of what is the line. I do understand that as time passes, political movements and parties and issues do mean that you can be moving together or apart. And that kind of understanding, but that also can change. That flows in a different kind of way, that the times can be wounded and recover in a way that I cannot recover as an individual human being from something that is done to me. If I'm in a horrific car accident, I will probably never recover in the same way that I could from, a multiple level of groups and people interacting. The leadership of all of those organizations change, the views change, and sometimes for the good and sometimes not for the good. And so I guess I'm sort of shying away from the individualization of something that is a much more complicated organism and entity, like an entire country, especially one like the United States, where in California, actually, and I was just reading some information about Georgia and how many are actually people who have come to this country for their citizenship. So it's not like they've been here forever, ever. We're not a country that's been here forever, ever. And that also means that we're very dynamic. It's very fluid. What was once red can become blue. What was once blue can become red. And I think that gives a lot more hope. I hope that brings more possibilities into the situation so that people can actually shift the mood and the tenor and the way we try and conduct ourselves. I lived out of the country for 25 years and watched the United States from afar, moving further and further into this kind of he said, she said positioning.
Mm.
And it's been painful to watch. But by the same token, I was back in the UK for the Brexit election, and I kept warning my friends who were saying, "Oh, no, it's all going to be fine. It'll be great." I'm like, no, you don't understand. You're in the bubble, and you're not hearing all of the people who feel disenfranchised or disenchanted or unhappy, and they have every reason to be disenfranchised and unhappy, and you're not hearing them. If you don't hear them and see them, then they will bite you. Like, this is what happened in the Brexit election. And it's what then, I mean, the whole Brexit Trump election, as you say, there was kind of this whole parallel, and I actually predicted Trump would win, and I predicted Brexit would happen, because I kept saying, you don't see the people that I see out in the places where no one is paying attention. And by that, I mean, really neither the Republicans nor the Democrats are paying real attention to the people who are actually out there hurting and not being helped. And so, of course, they're going to spring back at you. It's a Chinese proverb of the human spirit is like a spring. The harder you press it down, the higher it will leap when it is released. And I think that we've pushed down the human spirit in a lot of very ugly ways in a lot of parts of the world, and they will spring back, and we should not be shocked. I mean, we might be horrified, but it shouldn't be a surprise.
That was awesome. I mean, clinical psychologist, academic professor. Great question. I know I got it one. I'm sorry, Rabbi. The professor has to go. Before you go, Professor, though, we will email you a copy of the video. If you would think about recommendations, is there anybody you know who'd be willing to have an honest conversation? I hope we showed that we're not doing gotcha journalism. This wasn't designed to trick anybody. We just want to have an honest conversation. If you know other people, we would love to interview them.
And thank you, Marcus. It's always a delight to chat. And thank you, Rabbi. I think that there's a lot of conversation that we could have had. And I'm sorry that it's the end of the semester here on campus, and therefore I have students sort of lined up outside my door trying to get us through to the end of the semester. So I'm afraid I'm otherwise engaged.
Super quick question, Marcus.
Yeah.
And you can answer this after the professor leaves, possibly. Where can we read her writings? And second question is, I feel like I learned a lot. Where can I send my tuition check?
Cal Poly Humboldt. I work in the Department of Politics here. My most recent book was published with Palgrave in 2020 and 2020, which is the Multi-Layered Diplomacy and the International Affairs of California. And very kind of you to ask. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Please think of any recommendations of anybody that might be willing to be part of this. We will send you a copy of the show, and we deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'll let you go there. Okay. Thank you. Now, for everybody, let me do what the rabbi suggested. Give me 1 second. That's a great suggestion. We're going to pull it up. I'm sorry, Rabbi. I was trying to do my best to fit everything in, and she just didn't have much time.
This is the discussion that could go for 3-4 hours easily.
I want to have her back.
She's very intelligent, obviously. And obviously, we don't agree on many things. So it could have gone a very long time, and I would have learned a lot.
Well, I'm hoping that some of these professors will want to come back. I'm hoping that they'll see that this is just a straightforward interview. Come as you are. You can have whatever opinion you want. I'm for it. I'm against it. I'm this, I'm that. We just want to talk to you and do what you did. Because I could tell we were asking her tough questions she may not have thought about before. And I've seen that with the other professors. And that's what I like doing. I like putting them in tough spots and getting some.
I thought she was quite well thought out. I was pretty impressed with that part. She didn't hem and haw. She had strong opinions, and they seemed to be educated opinions. I thought that was pretty impressive, that part of it.
Yeah.
And I would have asked her 2 questions, but among many questions. Number one, when you watch Thomas Massey in a shouting match in the halls of Congress with Representative Bowman, I assume you caught that. That was all over the place. That's unusual in this country.
I mean, I thought you asked a good question. At what point do we split up? And obviously, all the professors' answers were brilliant and articulate and based upon years of experience. There was but she was also focused on, if we go down the negative road, we'll make it negative. And if we go down the positive road, we can make it more positive. And I
That's
saw
interesting because that's the therapist hat, which is the hat she rejected. So it's fascinating to me. That's what I would say as a therapist. That was interesting. And also I would have talked about, are we self-sorting? We had a
right.
governor in New York who literally said, we don't want you here, to the conservatives. And right before I came on with you, I have contacts in Florida, and it was suggested I listen to their debate, which is going on live now, about transgender bathrooms. And one of the Democratic reps got up in the state house and said, please do not leave our state. Please stay here and fight. Because what's happening is people are saying, you know what, I'm not going to win here. Let me go to a state where I get to do what I want. And I think we are self-sorting.
We are. I wasn't able to get into the big sort data that shows we've really sorted ourselves out already.
I mean, I'm as far away from you as I can get, Marcus.
But you were already there, and I was already here.
I
didn't get into the big sort data. I hope she comes back. Professor, when you watch this, I hope that you know that this guy below, and I am, all three of us said you were brilliant and you had great observations and analysis. The rabbi said it a second ago. I said the same thing. And so did one of our commentators. So everybody thought you were brilliant. Everybody thought you had articulate answers. And I was especially pleased with the fact that you were willing to be honest and answer the questions. I mean, you didn't demur from questions, Professor. So I really appreciate that. Last minute comments, Rabbi. Any? Can we celebrate this woman more?
I have to tell you something. Having gone, I have a master's degree. It was a pleasure to listen to someone so well educated. Nothing against social work schools, but not everybody is as well educated. So it was actually a treat to listen to somebody who knew so much and thought so much and could eloquently share all of that. So to me, that was refreshing.
That's her. She's an American, born and raised in Oklahoma, but then she went to Northern Ireland when they were having the Troubles, or just after that. She also studied in Chicago, great policy school. Then she went to the London School of Economics. And then she also helped the Liberal Democrats win an election in England. And then she got her first diploma in world politics and a PhD. So she's been to London. She's been to Ireland. She's helped British campaigns. She's from America. She's got her PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. I mean, that's where like the people who advise James Bond in those movies go to school. So super well educated, super well traveled. Just a privilege to have her here. And that's what you're saying, I think, is why these conversations are important.
My challenge to you, Marcus, is to get her on a show together with Nigel Farage.
Oh, woo! That would be entertainment. That would be in it, because she could take Nigel all the way to the cleaners. She has her facts. She has the background.
I think it'll be fascinating. I mean, I'm always fascinated from people who disagree. Can they have these good conversations? And it's interesting because if I heard her correctly, the professor, she said she was not happy with some of the ways that MTG is referred to. And I think I heard her correctly when she said,
yes.
Can we have a conversation without calling each other names and cursing each other out, etc.? Because that's what's lacking. And if she wants to be optimistic about the country not divorcing, that's the only hope. And it's not something I'm seeing happening, but that would be the only hope.
I totally agree. And that's the other half of these interviews. So what you did with the professor, high level questions, making professors think out in different ways and getting the answers. Yes. But the other half is that looking at the reactions of these professors in aggregate over all of them, we also start to come to patterns. The fact is that out of 20 professors, she is the only one to say that.
Interesting.
So that's a small survey size, but I think that also says something. Out of 20 people, she's the only one to go, I don't like her either, but when you call her these names, you are helping the division that you say you don't like that Marjorie's causing. First person I've heard to say that. Everybody else was like, Marjorie's trash. It's okay to call her trash. So
that must be my calming influence.
I, I whatever it is, maybe we'll see more people. We interviewed another person who was saying, America can come together, we can heal all of our wounds, and they were a hardcore conservative who worked with liberals. But I had to ask them, you're the only person I met doing that. So you're saying we can come back together, but you are literally the only person out of 20 people I've interviewed who is a hardcore conservative who is actually having those conversations with liberals. So there's also the answer they give, and then there's the how does that fit with the selection of answers across all the interviews? And we're getting a different picture of where this conversation is in the mind of Americans. And it's fascinating. I don't think anybody else is doing this. We talked to Professor Valier of Bowling Green State University yesterday, and he is very well versed on polarization studies and polarization labs and the professors looking at it. And he said basically it's almost an unstudied topic with very little academic inquiry. And the academic community of America is just now this year starting to figure out, oh, we need to put some serious time into political polarization and studying it. So our conversations here that we're having are possibly the only ones of their kind in America, because when we were talking to this professor, he was talking about how this field of study is at the fetal stage. It's not even born, isn't even a baby, it's a fetus. That might explain why.
Well, you mean a clump of cells?
I'm not getting into that. I'm not. No, sir. We are. I see what you're doing there.
I know. The other question I had, the other question, and maybe you've asked it to some people, is what is the lifespan of a country? And is there an expectation that any country throughout history or in the future would ever survive forever?
True. And I wanted to ask her, there is a book called How Civil Wars Start by Barbara F. Walter. It was covered in the New York Times. Barbara F. Walter is a former CIA analyst. She is studying, she tells the CIA when countries are going to collapse. She's done this for 20 years. According to her metrics, America's ticking up 80% of the metrics. Doesn't mean it's going to collapse tomorrow, but this agency that's part of the CIA that tells the CIA when a country is going to collapse is saying themselves, America's ticking up all the metrics.
Would this be the CIA that didn't think Russia was going to attack Ukraine? That CIA?
That's true.
Yeah.
True.
I do have a lot of respect for CIA.
Okay, fair enough. However, she works in a totally different department, so she's not the predicting.
I happen to agree. I happen to agree that America is at the explosive stage, but
she's just saying there's these tickers, and the thing that gets me is she's saying the opposite of what a lot of the professors are saying. The professors who have an international background are saying, when you look at other countries, they had these ethnic conflicts, and that's what caused their civil war, and we don't have anything like that. Barbara Walter is saying, not true. We do have an ethnic conflict, white supremacy. It was activated by Donald Trump, and there are millions of people now who see themselves as an ethnic, white, disabused person. Obviously, not every Caucasian person. Many people are Caucasian in California, would never have those ideas, but there's something there. And
well, you're probably aware that the white male is the one who feels discriminated against. I'm sure you've heard that in places. And, and it's interesting because when she went there, we don't have the religious conflict. There's a lot of people who believe that, climate change is a religion, atheism is a religion. And I personally, being a clergy person, do not know the definition of a religion. I'll say that up front. You don't have to believe in God to be religious. It's a very strong belief system that encompasses a whole bunch of things, maybe. So I think we do have a religious conflict. It's just not church versus church.
And that's what she said. She said there is this convergence of some sort of Christian identity. Could be Catholic, could be Protestant, whatever, maybe even Jewish, just sort of Judeo-Christian sort of concept. Oh, is that offensive? Oh, guess we lost the rabbi. I wasn't trying to offend anybody. I was just saying Barbara F. Walter, the CIA analyst, says that there's a convergence of religion, ethnicity, and conservative political ideology that's coming together to create an ethnic cleavage like we've seen in other countries before they went into civil war. So we'll leave it there. I'm going to email the rabbi to make sure he's back.
How about that?
All good. I got to go in a minute anyways, but I was just saying that a lot of the professors that I've seen so far, and I'm waiting to hold my opinion, are saying other countries had ethnic conflicts. There was ethnic problems before they entered into civil war or a breakdown. Barbara F. Walter saying we're doing that because Donald Trump activated rural, conservative, Christian, white people to start seeing a common identity in that. And that is exactly the kind of ethnic cleavage that has led to civil wars in other countries. She said, we're not there yet, but don't assume this can't happen here, and don't assume we're not already building up the walls for an ethnic conflict. Basically, isolated, conservative, rural, Christian-loving whites versus everybody else, which would also include other white people.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Problem solved. America's fixed. We will continue to. Oh, and I wanted to ask you, Rabbi, if you know any other professors, I would love to have a panel of of psychologists.
Yeah, you asked me about it. I'm going to think about it because it's a really interesting question. So
I was just thinking, if we had 3 or 4 clinical psychologists talking about how do you heal fear at the national level, given what you all know in psychology, great show.
I actually have a retort to that, but we can talk about that another time.
Okay. Thank you all. We want to say thank you to the professor. Everybody was impressed with Professor Alison Holmes, our guest here, both of us as speakers. She was honest, she was brilliant, she was informed and articulate. We hope to have her back again. Thank you all, and we'll see you again with our next interview.